All right, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about Errol Spence, Jaron Ennis, and Virgil Ortiz, and what is most likely going to happen with the IBF Mandatory that Errol Spence Jr. is due. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video we're going to talk about the welterweight division once again. My favorite division in boxing, has, I believe, that maybe along with the lightweight division, has the most talent in boxing, and an up-and-coming fighter and an established fighter, I believe, are two of the top most talented fighters in boxing, and that is Jaron Ennis, Errol Spence Jr., and another guy, Virgil Ortiz, and what most likely is going to take place with the IBF coming up soon. But before I get into that, make sure to please, if you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so that you can be notified of when we release more videos. It would be greatly appreciated. Also, tune into the live streams that we do every day, Sunday through Friday at 8 a.m. Central Standard Time, 9 a.m. Eastern, where we have very live boxing conversations that I think you will really enjoy. But let's get to it. Okay, Errol Spence Jr. is the IBF and the WBC champion in the welterweight division, and he is due to defend his belt against Yordenis Ugas, and will be, if he is successful, consolidating the WBA, the IBF, and the WBC all under his reign as a welterweight champion. But after that is over, there is a big question as to what he is going to be able to do next. So many people want to see the Terrence Crawford fight, myself included, but there's a lot of drama going on and back and forth about Terrence Crawford and Terrence Crawford's professional career, specifically where he's going to sign, who is going to promote him if he's not promoting himself. Is there enough money in the fight between Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence to make that fight? Will they be able to work out the deal? If they're not able to work out that deal, then Errol Spence Jr. most likely is going to be ordered to fight his IBF Mandatory, because the IBF Mandatory, he is not, every time you have a championship belt, every year, and that I know that is true for the WBO, the IBF, and WBC, with the exception of the WBA, who only will order a WBA super champion to defend his belt, give him a mandatory under certain circumstances. But the other three, you're supposed to defend yourself. You're supposed to defend your mandatory every year. But seeing as guys that have 2 and 3 belts would have 2 and 3 mandatories a year, it doesn't always come off that way. So Errol Spence Jr. has not defended his IBF against an IBF mandatory challenger since he fought Carlos Ocampo a couple years ago. So he was, the mandatory for him was named. It was a guy named Kurtatio Abukarav, and Abukarav just lost. So there was no mandatory. So now it appears that the IBF is going to not name a direct mandatory for Errol Spence Jr., but have an IBF title eliminator, which would then, the winner would then become the mandatory for Errol Spence Jr. And in the rankings of the IBF that have come out, the rankings are number 3 guy, number 1 is empty, number 2 is empty, and number 3 is Errol Spence Jr. Number 4 is Virgil Ortiz. So those 2 guys are most likely the ones that are going to be ordered to do the title eliminator. And the reason that the people are saying this, and I think that this is reasonable, is because that is exactly what is happening with the IBF in the heavyweight division with Voracek. Voracek has been, their number 1 or number 2 were vacant, and Voracek, who's a heavyweight, was actually, the number 1 is vacant. Number 2 was Luis Ortiz, and number 3 was Wojciech, and they ordered the title eliminator between Ortiz and Wojciech, but Luis Ortiz turned that down, and now the eliminator finally get it. And then I think they also put after Luis Ortiz turned it down, they offered it over to Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker turned the Wojciech fight down, and now they've offered it to Tony Yoka out of France, the heavyweight out of France. Good fighter out of big, tall French heavyweight Tony Yoka, and Tony Yoka took him up. So the winner of Wojciech and Tony Yoka is now going to be the mandatory for the IBF champion, who is Alexander Usyk. So they're doing the same thing apparently in the IBF with Jaron Ennis and Virgil Ortiz. Now, that is not to say that I believe that those two guys, that I personally believe that those two guys are going to fight. I think that you might wind up having yourself in the same type of situation that you have at heavyweight with the IBF title eliminator, and that is one guy that's gung-ho for it and another guy that is not. Jaron Ennis, I'm quite sure, will be gung-ho for it. He said that that's where he was highest rated, and that was the most likely, route that he was going to take to get the IBF, and that he also believed that more than likely they were going to order a title eliminator for that, for that mandatory position. My only question is whether Virgil Ortiz is going to actually participate in that if he is ordered to fight, if and when, because I do believe that the IBF will do it. The IBF is not the WBC. The IBF does not behave like the WBO, and the IBF does not behave like the WBA. The IBF is about, with their president, Daryl Peebles, is about as straight shooting an organization as you got. They will tell you when they order people to fight, they do so without a lot of consideration of the politics involved in it. For example, when Canelo Alvarez was the champion for the IBF at 160 pounds, they ordered him to fight Sergey Deverenchenko. Sergey Deverenchenko had been the mandatory for Gennady Golovkin before they gave him an exemption to fight. When Canelo Alvarez chose not to fight Sergey Deverenchenko, the IBF stripped him of the WBA the IBF stripped him of his IBF title. And if they're willing to do that to Canelo Alvarez, they're willing to enforce their rules against anybody, which means ordering Virgil Ortiz to fight Jaron Ennis or ordering Errol Spence Jr. to fight Jaron Ennis. Those guys are not something that is, you can almost go straight logic with what's going to happen in the IBF. And versus with the other organizations, you have to be like, all right, but what about the politics in it, right? For example, what just happened recently where they have a title eliminator between Keith Thurman and Mario Barrios, right? Now, the president of the WBC came out and said, well, it's not a final eliminator. That fight doesn't automatically make him Errol Spence Jr.'s mandatory. However, dude, the WBC will switch rankings in a second. So if Keith Thurman enters in their rating off of a title eliminator, the only question is where in that ranking is he going to fall? And I think more than likely he could very well fall at the number 1 position or at the number 2 position. I don't think that he's going to be falling any further than number 2. So if he is number 1, number 2, or number 3 by the WBA rules, then he can be mandated. He can be named the mandatory by the WBC. There's nothing in their rules that say they have to take the number 1 guy. They just have to take a guy in the top 3 and a guy that they consider to be available. And if you look at what's happened in the WBO before, the WBO has literally removed people like Austin Trout just magically out of their rankings when it was time to name a mandatory for who was that I think it may have been for Miguel Cotto, right? I think it might have been a mandatory for Miguel Cotto. They just immediately just moved him up out of there. But the IBF doesn't operate like that, and the IBF would actually make that happen. I just don't know whether or not Virgil Ortiz and Golden Boy are going to be willing to put Virgil Ortiz up against Jaron Ennis at this stage of his career or at any other stage in his career, because Jaron Ennis most likely is going to beat Virgil Ortiz, and Virgil Ortiz is a very, very promising fighter. But anyway, it cuts it, with the rankings coming out in the IBF and those 2 spots being open and those guys starting to order those IBF mandatories, that is most likely what's going to happen, and that's what people are telling me that they believe will happen over there, but that doesn't necessarily mean, again, that Errol Spence Jr. is going to have to fight him right away, because that's going to take some time. And say they have one title eliminator, they may have two title eliminators. And if they have two title eliminators, then, that's 3 fights off before they name the mandatory. Right? Because title eliminator 1 is 1 fight, title eliminator 2 is 2 fights, and then the final eliminator is 3 fights. That, that's some old WBC type of stuff, but it may take a little bit of time to make that happen. But anyway, it looks like sooner or later, and I do believe sooner, because I think they're going to push Jaron Ennis faster than people think. That IBF mandatory is probably going to be Jaron Ennis, and then we'll see what happens with Errol Spence Jr. Anyway, that's my take on the matter. You make sure that you leave your comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.